The Great Wall did not begin as a fortress. It began as an emperor's dream. When Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, rose to power in the 3rd century BCE, he was consumed by two obsessions: eternal rule and eternal life. To him, stone and mortar were not simply defenses. They were monuments to his name, meant to last as long as the heavens themselves. The northern tribes, Xiongnu riders who swept down from the steppes, were real threats, yes, but they also became convenient symbols. By invoking fear of barbarians, Qin Shi Huang could justify enslaving peasants, soldiers, and scholars in his quest to stretch a dragon of stone across the mountains and deserts. The wall became his crown jewel, a project not only to shield the empire, but to brand it with his power. Yet beneath the grandeur, whispers spread among his people. Was the wall really for defense? Or was it a scar carved into the earth to satisfy the emperor's vanity? Was it to keep enemies out, or to keep subjects under control? Tens of thousands of laborers were conscripted, many never to return. Soldiers who resisted were executed and buried where they fell. Scholars who questioned the project vanished into silence. The emperor, already feared for burning books and burying dissenters alive, seemed to use the wall not merely as a shield against the outside world, but as a physical reminder of his absolute dominion. Even the emperor's own court began to fracture. Advisors clashed, some urging restraint, others feeding his mania. One legend tells of a minister who dared to say the wall was built on blood, not glory. His fate? His body was hurled into the foundations, entombed in the very monument he criticized. For Qin Shi Huang, the wall was more than stone. It was an extension of himself, a bid for immortality. As his alchemists hunted for the elixir of life, he poured the lifeblood of his people into his own legacy, building a monument meant to outlast mortality. The irony? The emperor who dreamed of eternal life would die in paranoia, poisoned by the very mercury his alchemists promised would grant him immortality. His empire would fracture within years, but his wall remained, a silent witness to his obsession. And so, from its very birth, the wall was marked by vanity, fear, and sacrifice, a monument less of protection than of control. If the emperor's vision gave the wall its birth, the blood and bones of countless laborers gave it form. The Great Wall became not just a monument of stone, but a graveyard stretching across mountains and deserts. Tens of thousands, peasants, soldiers, prisoners, scholars, were conscripted to the wall. They marched in endless columns, shackled by duty or chains, sent to landscapes where the land itself seemed hostile. Under a blazing sun or in howling snowstorms, they cut into cliffs, dragged boulders by rope, and stacked bricks until their hands bled raw. Food was scarce, water scarcer, and disease thrived in the labor camps. The saying spread like wildfire: for every brick in the wall, a life was lost. At night, the camps echoed with cries. Men collapsed from exhaustion and were left where they fell. The overseers, harsh and merciless, drove whips into backs, their orders fueled by fear of imperial wrath. If a section of the wall faltered, if a work team slowed, the punishment was death. Whispers claimed the bodies of the dead were not simply buried nearby, but built into the wall itself, bones sealed beneath layers of earth and stone to strengthen its foundations. Whether true or myth, the image endured, that the wall was held together not only by mortar, but by the blood of its builders. Folktales began to circle. Workers believed the restless spirits of those who died wandered along the battlements, crying for release. Ghost fires, phantom lights that flickered at night, were said to be the souls of those buried alive within the wall's endless coils. Soldiers assigned to garrisons muttered that they felt unseen eyes upon them, as though the wall itself was alive, haunted by those who gave their lives unwillingly. And yet, despite the death and misery, construction pressed on. For the emperor, lives were expendable. What mattered was the illusion of permanence, the sight of stone spines stretching across mountains, proof of his dominion. The people, however, remembered differently. To them, the wall was not glory, it was grief. It was the grave of fathers, brothers, and sons who never returned. It was a scar on the land that would forever remind them of tyranny. The wall became a paradox, a symbol of power to the rulers, a monument of sorrow to the ruled. And in the shadows of this grief, new legends began to stir, tales of resistance, rebellion, and one woman whose tears would make the wall itself tremble. Among all the tales born of the wall's misery, none endures more powerfully than that of Meng Jiangnu, the grieving widow whose sorrow became legend. She was no warrior, no noble, no emperor, only a woman whose husband was taken to labor on the wall. He was dragged away on the night of their wedding, his hands still marked with the crimson of bridal rituals. Like thousands of others, he vanished into the emperor's endless hunger for stone and blood. For months, Meng Jiangnu waited. Seasons turned, yet no word came. At last, she set out across the empire, braving deserts, rivers, and mountains, carrying with her nothing but hope and a cloak she had sewn with her own hands to warm her husband in the bitter northern winds. When she arrived at the wall, she searched among the camps, calling his name, but all she found were gaunt faces, silent graves, and cruel overseers who sneered at her questions. At last, the truth reached her. Her husband had perished, his body lost beneath the stones, another nameless soul swallowed by the wall. Her grief became a storm. Standing before the endless ramparts, she wept so fiercely that the very heavens seemed to answer. Her cries shook the stones, and the wall collapsed in sections, revealing the bones of the countless dead buried within its foundations. The overseers were horrified, but the people whispered in awe. If emperors had raised the wall with cruelty, then a widow's tears had the power to tear it down. In later retellings, Meng Jiangnu's fate shifted. Some said she was executed for defying the emperor's will, her body drowned in the river. Others claimed she vanished into the ruins she had uncovered, joining the restless spirits of the dead. Still others believed the gods transformed her into a goddess of justice, her voice carried forever on the winds that whip across the wall's battlements. Whatever the truth, her legend became a weapon. It was passed from village to village, whispered among workers, sung as a ballad of defiance. The emperor may have commanded soldiers and stone, but Meng Jiangnu commanded something more dangerous, the people's memory. Her story turned the wall into more than a monument. It became a stage where sorrow battled power, where myth carried truths that history could not openly tell. And in the wake of her tears, one question grew louder. Was the wall built to defend the people or to bury them? For centuries, the Great Wall has been remembered as a bulwark against northern nomads, a dragon of stone whose sole purpose was to keep enemies at bay. But beneath this simple tale lies a darker truth. Much of the wall was turned inward, aimed not at the Mongols, but at the Chinese themselves. The emperors who ordered its construction understood that power was not only about defending borders, it was about controlling those within them. The wall's watchtowers are not only lookouts for raiders, but sentinels that monitored the empire's own subjects. Families traveling between provinces, peasants moving in search of food, merchants carrying goods, all passed beneath the watchful eyes of soldiers stationed on the ramparts. At each gate, tolls were extracted, documents inspected, and loyalties tested. Those without proper papers risked being branded as deserters or rebels. What was claimed to be a defensive line was, in practice, a net of surveillance and taxation. The wall regulated trade as much as it blocked invasion, ensuring that the emperor's coffers grew fat with silver, silk, and grain. The barrier slowed migration and tightened the leash on restive provinces, making it harder for local warlords to slip beyond imperial control. For the common people, the wall was a cage. Farmers who once moved freely with the seasons found their paths blocked. Merchants carrying salt, tea, or horses were forced into heavily taxed corridors, their livelihoods squeezed by imperial decree. Even soldiers stationed on the wall became prisoners in their own garrisons, trapped in remote outposts where supplies ran thin and winters cut to the bone. And in a cruel irony, the wall that promised protection often failed at its supposed purpose. Northern raiders, whether Xiongnu, Khitan, or Mongol, slipped through unmanned gates or bribed corrupt officials to open them. While enemies rode through with ease, it was the empire's own people who bore the weight of its restrictions. Thus, the wall became a symbol of suspicion, an empire mistrusting of its subjects, forever fearful of rebellion. Its stones carried not only the sweat of the builders, but also the quiet despair of a people fenced in by their own rulers. This revelation shifted the meaning of the wall entirely. It was not just a fortress of war, it was an instrument of paranoia, proof that the emperor's greatest fear was not always the barbarian at the gates, but the unrest simmering within. And just as the wall confined the living, its myths began to trap the dead. Folktales, betrayals, and ghost stories fused with reality, blurring the line between power and superstition. If the wall was built on bones, it is no wonder the living believed it was haunted. Generation after generation whispered that the Great Wall was not merely stone and mortar, but a vessel of souls, restless, angry, and unwilling to be forgotten. By night, sentries swore they saw pale flames flicker along the battlements, ghost fires said to be the spirits of laborers burned out of the world too soon. Others spoke of wailing winds that carried voices, cries that seemed to echo in languages no soldier could recognize. When blizzards rolled in from the steppes, men claimed to hear drums beating in the snow, as if phantom armies still marched toward the wall. Among the most famous legends was that of Meng Jiangnu's tears. Her grief had shaken the wall, but many said her spirit never left. Travelers told of a woman in white wandering the ramparts, her sleeves soaked with endless tears, calling out for the husband she never found. To meet her gaze, it was believed, meant certain death before winter's end. But she was not alone. Countless local tales painted the wall as a graveyard that refused to stay silent. Bricked-in souls, workers supposedly buried alive in the foundations, were said to scratch at the stones, leaving faint claw marks visible centuries later. Betrayer's Gate. One ruined section was linked to a general who opened the gates for enemy gold. After his execution, travelers reported hearing chains dragging in the night as though his ghost still patrolled, bound to his crime. The hungry wall. Peasants believed that if you leaned against certain parts of the wall, you could hear it whisper, demanding more lives to feed its hunger. Such stories were not just folklore, they shaped how the people saw the empire itself. The wall became a mirror of imperial cruelty, where even the dead could not find peace. Some scholars argue that these ghost tales were a quiet form of rebellion. Peasants dared not curse the emperor openly, but they could tell their children that the wall itself was cursed, a warning carved in whispers rather than in stone. And perhaps strangest of all, the emperors themselves listened. Records tell of dynasties that performed rituals along the wall, offering animal sacrifices, incense, and prayers to calm the spirits that supposedly dwelled within it. Even rulers who claimed to embody reason and order bowed before the wall's spectral reputation. Thus, the wall was no longer merely a fortress or a cage. It became a stage where politics, paranoia, and the supernatural collided. To walk upon its battlements was to tread not only on the empire's might, but on a graveyard of unquiet souls. And in the shadows of these tales came darker truths of betrayal, corruption, and the selling out of the wall's very purpose.
For all its length and grandeur, the Great Wall was never the unbreakable barrier emperors wanted their people to believe. Its true weakness was not stone or mortar, it was human greed. From the earliest dynasties to the Ming, officials entrusted with guarding the wall often turned its gates into bargaining tables. Bribes of silver, gold, silk, and horses bought safe passage through doors that were supposed to stay sealed. Nomadic raiders, who should have been kept at bay, often rode straight into the empire, not by scaling battlements, but by paying the right commander to look the other way. In some cases, it was worse. Generals tasked with defending the wall secretly traded with the very enemies they were meant to fight. Horses from the steppe were exchanged for Chinese tea and silk, enriching both sides while weakening imperial defenses. Records whisper of commanders who deliberately left gates unguarded on stormy nights, then shared in the spoils of the raids that followed. One of the most infamous betrayals came during the Ming Dynasty, when the wall was at its strongest. In 1644, as rebel armies closed in on Beijing, General Wu Songui, commander of a vital wall pass, faced a choice. Instead of standing firm, he struck a desperate deal with the invading Manchu forces. He flung open the gates of the wall, not to enemies he feared, but to allies he hoped to use. The decision doomed the Ming and ushered in the Qing dynasty. The wall, that mighty dragon, had been undone not by force, but by a single man's treachery. For peasants who lived under its shadow, this hypocrisy was salt in a wound. They had given their sweat, blood, and dead to build the wall. They had been caged by its tolls and taxed at its gates. Yet, when danger truly came, the wall did not protect them. It became a revolving door for raiders, rebels, and traitors alike. Thus the wall's story twisted yet again. What emperors presented as a monument of defense was revealed as a theater of corruption, where loyalty was for sale and security was an illusion. And out of this corruption emerged a shocking paradox. The wall that claimed to separate civilization from barbarians often became the very bridge that bound them together. Trade, alliance, and betrayal blurred the lines between enemy and friend. It was in these moments that the wall ceased to be a fortress of defense and became instead a stage for politics, opportunism, and the fragile nature of human loyalty. But while men traded and betrayed, the myths of the wall continued to grow, each dynasty weaving its own story of why it mattered. And in these competing myths, the wall's true identity began to fracture.
When people imagine the Great Wall, they see one unbroken dragon of stone slithering across the mountains. But in truth, there was never a single seamless wall. What we call the Great Wall was instead a mosaic of walls, raised, abandoned, and rebuilt by rival dynasties, each carving their mark on the land. The first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, is often credited with beginning the wall, but his wall was more a hurried stitching together of older fortifications built by feuding kingdoms. It was mud and tamped earth, fragile against time, built more for symbolism than for permanence. When his dynasty fell, much of it crumbled with him. Centuries later, the Han Dynasty built anew, stretching its own walls deep into deserts to guard caravan routes along what would become the Silk Road. These walls were less about keeping enemies out and more about controlling trade and taxes, a line of stone and watchtowers that doubled as custom checkpoints. Then came the northern dynasties, the Tang, the Ming, each adding, extending, or repairing their own version of the wall. The Ming, facing the powerful Mongols, rebuilt the wall in stone and brick, giving it the strength that survives today. But even then, their wall was not one continuous line. It was a tangle of branches, overlapping fortresses and rival sections competing for dominance. The result was a paradox. The Great Wall was never truly unified until long after its builders were gone. It was instead a battlefield of dynastic pride. Each emperor sought to outdo the last, not merely in defense, but in spectacle. To raise a taller, stronger, longer section of wall was to etch one's dynasty into eternity. Yet these competing ambitions often led to chaos. One dynasty's wall might fall into ruin, while another rose beside it. A pass guarded by one ruler could be abandoned by the next. The people, peasants, soldiers, traders, were left to navigate this ever-shifting labyrinth of stone, where allegiance could change as fast as the banners flying above the battlements. What endured was not a singular wall, but the illusion of one. Later generations, looking back, wove these scattered fragments into a single myth, the Great Wall of China, a story of unity told over the bones of rivalry. And in this illusion lies another twist. The wall that is celebrated today as the symbol of a single Chinese civilization was, for much of its history, a patchwork born of division, fear, and competition. Which raises the question, was the wall ever truly built to unite? Or was it always a mirror of the fractures it claimed to conceal? Though the Great Wall loomed as a symbol of division, civilization against barbarism, empire against nomad, the truth is far more tangled. For centuries, the wall that claimed to separate worlds also became a bridge between them. Where there were gates, there were opportunities. The wall's watchtowers and passes doubled as customs checkpoints, where caravans laden with goods waited to be inspected, taxed, and sometimes plundered by corrupt officials. Horses from the steppe, prized for their stamina and strength, were traded for silk, tea, and porcelain. Grain flowed north, furs and livestock flowed south. The most famous of these exchanges unfolded along the Silk Road, where wall passes guarded critical routes. Officially, the emperors forbade certain trades with barbarians, fearing it would empower enemies. But reality was different. Behind closed gates, soldiers and merchants struck deals in secret. Nomadic chiefs who were once called raiders became trade partners, their saddlebags filled with imperial luxuries. Some dynasties even institutionalized this paradox. The Han and later the Tang offered tribute trade, where nomadic leaders were allowed to pass through the wall under the pretense of paying respect to the emperor. In exchange, they received lavish gifts, silks, gold, and even princesses in marriage alliances. To the Chinese court, this was diplomacy. To the nomads, it was commerce wrapped in ceremony. But trade across the wall was not always peaceful. When negotiations failed, merchants were attacked, caravans plundered, and trade turned back into raiding. More than once, the wall's garrisons, poorly paid and starving, survived only by smuggling and black market exchange with the very enemies they were stationed to repel. For the common people, the wall was not a boundary between us and them. It was a marketplace of survival. A herder on the steppe might sell horses to the wall's soldiers one week, then raid a poorly defended village the next. A Chinese merchant might bribe a gatekeeper to sell grain to the north, then return south with furs and jade, his profit outweighing the emperor's decrees. Thus, the wall became a paradoxical artery, at once barrier and lifeline. While emperors proclaimed it a shield, its stones became the backdrop of bustling markets where enemy and ally were indistinguishable. And so every transaction blurred the very divide the wall was meant to enforce. Was it a line of separation or a corridor of connection? The answer was both. And in that contradiction, the wall's true nature emerged. It was not merely a monument of war, but a stage where trade, politics, and survival danced hand in hand. Yet for all the gold and silk exchanged, one currency mattered most: the crafting of myth. For dynasties rose and fell, but the story of the wall only grew larger, bending truth and legend into a single enduring tale. For much of its history, the wall was a patchwork. Rival dynasties built, abandoned, and rebuilt sections that often competed with one another. Yet centuries later, when the dust of empire settled, a new story emerged, one that blurred contradictions and crafted a powerful illusion. The wall was reimagined not as fragments, but as a single, eternal structure, the Great Wall of China. This myth of unity did not arise naturally. It was carefully shaped by rulers, poets, and historians who understood that symbols often outlive truth. The wall, once a reminder of tyranny and loss, was recast as the spine of a civilization, proof of China's greatness and endurance. In Ming times, the wall's massive stone fortifications, stronger and more enduring than earlier mud walls, gave the illusion of continuity. Later dynasties leaned on this image, claiming that their reigns stood in a line stretching back to Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. By erasing the gaps, rivalries, and betrayals of the past, the wall became a monument to unity, not division. But this unity was more imagined than real. For peasants who still whispered of Ming Zhongnu's tears or cursed the labor camps, the wall was no proud emblem. For border communities who lived off smuggling and black market trade, it was no patriotic shield. And for scholars, the wall was often a bitter reminder of wasted lives and failed strategies. But over time, the myth triumphed. Poems praised the wall as a dragon guarding the Middle Kingdom. Artists painted it winding across mountains, stretching endlessly, unbroken. Foreign travelers marveled at its scale and repeated the legend abroad. Slowly, the story hardened. The wall had always been one, always defended China, always united its people. In reality, the wall's true history, fragmented, corrupt, haunted, was buried beneath layers of propaganda. But in myth, it became something greater than stone, an idea. And in that idea lay power. By embracing the wall as a symbol of unity, emperors could bind their subjects to a shared identity, even when their rule was shaky. Long after dynasties fell, the wall's image remained, teaching future generations not necessarily what was true, but what was useful. Thus, the greatest construction of all may not have been the wall itself, but the story of the wall, a tale woven from fragments into a seamless illusion that continues to this day. Yet behind the myth still lurked one last twist, the question of its true legacy. Was the wall built to protect, to imprison, or simply to project an image of power that outlived the rulers who demanded it? Today, the Great Wall coils across mountains like the spine of a sleeping dragon, its stones worn but unyielding. Tourists walk its battlements, marveling at its scale, and textbooks declare it the ultimate symbol of China's endurance. But peel back the layers of myth, and its legacy reveals something far stranger and more powerful than mere defense. The wall never truly kept enemies out. Mongols, Xiongnu, Khitan, and Manchu all rode through or around it. Gates were bribed open, garrisons abandoned, commanders betrayed their posts. As a military fortress, the wall was porous, inconsistent, and often ineffective. Yet its failure as a fortress was precisely what made it succeed as something else, a monument of identity. Each dynasty that touched the wall used it less as a shield and more as a stage for its own story. To the Qin, it proved the emperor's authority to bind a fractured land. To the Han, it secured trade and proclaimed China's reach into the deserts. To the Ming, its stone ramparts projected strength in the face of Mongol power. And to later generations, it became the physical embodiment of China itself, a civilization so vast and ancient that it left behind a scar visible from the heavens. The wall was propaganda made solid. It reminded subjects of imperial might, frightened them into obedience, and inspired awe in foreign visitors who carried its legend back across oceans. It was less a military barrier than a psychological one, shaping how people imagined China, both inside and outside its borders. Even the myths that clung to its stones, Meng Jimongnu's tears, ghostly lights, tales of betrayal, were absorbed into this legacy. They transformed the wall into something more than politics or stone, a symbol of suffering, sacrifice, and endurance. It was at once a scar and a crown, a prison and a monument, a warning and a boast. And so the final twist emerges. The Great Wall's real purpose may never have been to stop armies at all. Its true power was in the story it told, of emperors who ruled with iron will, of people who endured unimaginable hardship, and of a civilization that bound itself together not by conquest alone, but by a shared myth. The dragon's spine still stretches to the horizon, but its stones do more than mark the past. They whisper the wall's greatest secret. Its strength lies not in defense, but in memory.